They said the desert was no place to stay. They said winter would drive him out or bury him where he stood. A worn-out cowboy with nowhere left to go. A broken veteran carrying a war he couldn't leave behind. And a silent cave in the red rocks of Arizona that no one believed could save anyone. But when the cold came harder than anyone expected, and the world outside began to fail, this forgotten place did something no house ever had before. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Sedona, Arizona didn't feel like a postcard that winter. It felt like a test. The red rock mesas still glowed at dawn as if some old fire lived inside them. But the beauty came with teeth. Cold air poured down from the high desert at night, settling in pockets along the washes and canyon floors, turning every metal hinge into a complaint and every breath into a pale ribbon that vanished too quickly. The wind carried grit that found its way into cuffs, boot seams, and the corners of tired eyes. Most years, the locals talked about winter like it was a brief, polite visitor. 2 weeks of sharp mornings, a handful of frost-laced sunrises, then back to dry warmth. This year was different. The weather arrived early and stayed with an attitude. A string of hard fronts rolled through like they had business in town, dragging gray sky across the red stone, dropping flurries that looked gentle until they gathered in shadowed places and refused to melt. The creeks ran thin, the nights ran long, and the kind of quiet that makes people check their locks twice settled over the outskirts. At the edge of that harsh, gorgeous country, where the pavement surrendered to dirt and juniper, a man named Caleb Rourke moved the way someone moves when he doesn't intend to be noticed, steady, unhurried, but always ready to turn. He was 33, with a lean build earned the honest way, not in a gym but on long rides and longer days. His shoulders were broad without being bulky, and his hands looked like they belonged to a man who'd spent more time gripping reins and rope than a steering wheel. His jaw was sharp, the kind that caught the light at the wrong angle and made him look angrier than he felt. Dark stubble shaded his cheeks and chin, never quite a beard, never quite clean, because shaving had never ranked high on his list of urgent things. His hair was a sun-faded brown that curled at the ends when it got long, and right now it was too long, because when you live by the job you can get, you don't always have the luxury of a mirror and time. His eyes were the color of old whiskey, amber brown with a stubbornness behind them, and they had that watchful calm some men wear like a coat, the kind you don't notice until you realize nothing gets past it. Caleb didn't talk much. When he did, his voice came low, roughened by dust and cold, and he spoke in short sentences like, "Words cost money." People in town remembered him as that cowboy who used to work the South Ranch, then later, that cowboy who doesn't have a ranch anymore. The truth was simpler and harder. The work had dried up. The big outfits around Sedona weren't run by families the way they used to be. They were bought, consolidated, optimized, all the polite words for turning a living landscape into an equation. Fewer cattle, fewer hands, more fences, more locks, more signs that said no trespassing, as if the land itself had done something wrong. Caleb had watched it happen, season by season, with the same helplessness you feel when a river changes course. He'd been raised on the idea that if you worked hard and kept your word, the world would make room for you. But the world had started acting like it didn't owe anyone space. He'd tried to stay useful, mending fence lines, hauling feed, moving stock, until the day his foreman handed him a final check and shrugged like the decision had been made by weather. Caleb hadn't begged, he hadn't argued. Pride didn't pay rent, but it kept a man upright. He'd folded the check, tucked it into his coat, and walked out with the quiet dignity of someone leaving a place that had already left him. That was the event that sharpened him, the small betrayal that made his silence heavier. Not because he expected kindness, but because he'd expected sense. Since then, he'd taken whatever came. A week here, 3 days there, seasonal labor that never lasted long enough to feel like belonging in the pit. Meantime, he lived on the margins, sleeping in borrowed rooms, occasionally in his truck, sometimes under an overhang of rock when the weather was mild and he could convince himself that discomfort was the same thing as freedom. The only constant was his horse. Rust was old, older than he looked from a distance, his coat a muted chestnut with a gray bloom around the muzzle, the kind of animal that had learned patience the hard way. One ear always angled forward like he was listening for trouble, the other lazily swiveling as if to say, "I've heard it all." Rust wasn't fast anymore, but he was steady, and steadiness was worth more than speed when the world kept slipping sideways. Caleb talked to him sometimes, quietly, as if the horse were a friend who wouldn't interrupt. "Ain't much out there," he'd murmur, adjusting the cinch with stiff fingers. Rust would blink slowly, giving him that long-suffering look horses reserve for humans who think they're in charge. Caleb's humor was like that too, dry, almost invisible, more a tilt of the mouth than a laugh. On the morning the story truly began, Caleb rode out early, not because he had somewhere to be, but because staying still made the thoughts louder. The sky was a flat pewter, the kind that promised either snow or nothing at all, and the air cut at his lungs when he breathed in. He followed a dirt track that wound away from the tourist shops and art galleries, away from the polished version of Sedona that people drove in to photograph. Out here the land was raw, red rock cliffs, scrub oak, black juniper twisted by wind, and coyote tracks pressed into thin dust. He was looking for work, yes, but more than that he was looking for a sign. Something that said the next step wouldn't be just another mile of the same. The saddle creaked under him. Rust's hooves crunched over frost-hardened ground. Caleb kept his collar turned up, his hat pulled low, and his eyes scanning the ridges the way he always did, as if the land might suddenly produce an answer. By mid-morning the wind picked up, sliding through the canyon like a knife looking for a place to fit. It pushed grit into Caleb's face, made Rust toss his head. Caleb reached down, patted the horse's neck. "Easy," he said, the word warm against the cold. They cut off the track and angled toward a shallow ravine where the rock walls rose on either side. He'd been told there were old prospecting routes out this way, places where men once chased silver and found mostly heartbreak. Caleb didn't care about silver, he cared about shelter. A storm could roll in fast on the high desert, and the cold could turn meaner than it had any right to be. As they moved deeper between the rock faces, the wind quieted, the air changed. It smelled less like open desert and more like stone and dust, like something ancient holding its breath. Rust slowed without being asked, ears forward now, alert. That was when Caleb saw it. Not a mine shaft, not a crack, but a wide, natural opening in the red rock, half hidden by a slope of scree and a stand of juniper. The mouth of it faced east, catching what little light leaked through the clouds, and the overhang above it jutted like a brow. Caleb reined Rust in and sat there for a long moment. The opening wasn't dramatic in the way movie caves are. No jagged fangs, no theatrical darkness. But it had a quiet authority, like a door that had been in the same place for 1,000 years and didn't care who noticed. Caleb swung down, boots hitting stone with a dull thud. He walked up slowly, not from fear, but from respect. Inside, the temperature dropped a notch, the kind of cool that felt steady rather than biting. His breath didn't plume as harshly. The air was still. He stepped just far enough in that the wind behind him couldn't reach, and the sound of the world changed. Everything muffled, softened, as if the canyon had wrapped a blanket around his ears. He ran, a gloved hand along the wall. The rock was smooth in places, worn by time, rough in others where it had broken and healed. He could imagine it holding heat, holding silence, holding a man who didn't want to fight the weather every night. Caleb stood there, and for the first time in months, the tightness in his chest loosened. He didn't call it hope. Not yet. Cowboys like him didn't use that word lightly. But the thought arrived anyway, simple as a match struck in the dark. What if this could be something? Not a hiding place, not a stopgap. A beginning. Outside, Rust snorted softly, impatient or curious, and Caleb glanced back with a faint smile. "Yeah," he murmured, half to the horse, half to the stone. "I see it too." He stepped out again, squinting at the sky, feeling the wind's teeth at the edge of the ravine, then looked back at the cave mouth like it had just spoken his name. He didn't know yet who he'd tell or how he'd make anything of it. He only knew. The land had offered him a kind of answer, quiet, solid, and waiting. Caleb swung back into the saddle, turned Russ toward town, and rode with the cave's shadow lingering behind his eyes as if an old god of stone had winked and dared him to build something that could last. Caleb Rourke rode back toward Sedona with the cave riding in his thoughts the way a tune gets stuck in your head. Not loud, not demanding, but persistent enough that silence kept circling back to it. The wind had shifted by afternoon, turning sharper, and a thin veil of cloud dragged its belly across the red mesas as if the sky were tired. Rust plodded on, steady and sure, his breath puffing in soft bursts that hung and vanished. Caleb's mind kept returning to the feel of the stone under his glove, the way the air inside the cave had gone calm and cool, as if the land itself had decided to pause. He didn't tell himself stories about destiny. He'd seen too many men get ruined waiting for a sign that never came. But he trusted work, and he trusted places that made sense, and that cave had made sense in a way little else had lately. He stopped once on a rise and looked back toward the ravine, memorizing the line of juniper and the angle of the slope, the kind of careful attention a man gives to something he might need again. By the time he reached the outskirts of town, the light was already thinning, and Sedona had that end-of-day look, tourists retreating indoors, shop lights warming up, the practical people moving faster as the cold settled. Caleb headed not for Main Street, but for the far side, where trailers and old trucks clustered near a dry wash like a temporary camp that had forgotten to leave. He had business there, a small debt owed, and a bigger curiosity tugging at him. The trailer belonged to Elias Boone, a man Caleb knew only in passing until that morning when he'd helped him on the shoulder of a dirt road, the wind biting, the jack slipping in the frost. Elias had been wrestling with a flat tire, cursing under his breath with a tired precision that suggested practice. He was in his early 60s, tall but slightly stooped, his left leg stiff enough that he favored it when he walked. His face was narrow and lined, not from age alone but from a life spent squinting into hard light. A gray beard covered his jaw in uneven growth, thicker along the chin, thinner at the cheeks, as if he'd stopped caring halfway through. His hair, once dark, now hung silver and thin around his ears beneath a battered cap that bore the faint outline of a unit patch. Elias's eyes were pale blue, the washed-out kind you see in men who've watched too much horizon for too long. They were sharp, though, alert, missing nothing even when his body lagged behind. Caleb had noticed how Elias flinched when a truck backfired on the road above them, how his shoulders had gone tight before he mastered it and pretended nothing had happened. That kind of reflex didn't come from bad luck, it came from memory. Caleb hadn't asked questions. He'd knelt, braced the jack with a rock, and worked until the tire was changed. Elias had thanked him with a nod and an offer of coffee sometime, his voice steady but clipped, like he kept it on a short leash. Caleb had said sure, meaning maybe, meaning never, meaning life would decide. But now he found himself pulling Rust up beside the trailer as dusk pooled around the wash. The trailer was old and sun-bleached, its aluminum sides dulled and dented, a patchwork of repairs holding it together. A small wood stove vented through a crooked pipe, coughing a thin ribbon of smoke into the cold air. A battered folding chair sat outside, and near it lay a dog with 3 legs, a medium-sized mutt, black and tan, one hind leg missing clean at the joint. The dog lifted his head when Caleb approached, ears perked, tail thumping the dirt with a cheerful insistence that ignored the arithmetic of his body. "Evening," Caleb said softly, not wanting to startle anyone. The dog grinned at him, there was no other word for it, and pushed himself upright with a hop, trotting closer. His coat was rough but clean, his eyes bright and curious, and he smelled faintly of wood smoke. "Hey there," Caleb murmured, crouching to scratch behind the dog's ears. The dog leaned into it with a pleased groan. "Lucky," a voice called from inside the trailer, the door creaking open. Elias stepped out, moving carefully, his weight shifting to protect the bad leg. He held a chipped mug in one hand, steam curling up and fogging his beard. "Guess you found him," he said. His mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Name's aspirational." Lucky wagged harder, as if to agree. Caleb straightened, touching the brim of his hat. "Hope I'm not intruding," he said. "You mentioned coffee." Elias studied him for a moment, measuring the set of his shoulders, the quiet in his stance. Then he nodded and gestured toward the chair. "If you don't mind it being terrible," he said. "I've learned to like it that way." Caleb took the chair, the metal cold through his coat, and accepted the mug when Elias handed it over. The coffee was strong and burnt and exactly what he needed. They sat, for a minute without speaking, the dog settling between them like he belonged there, which he clearly did. A gust of wind rattled the trailer and Elias glanced up, jaw tightening before he smoothed it away. "Weather's turning," Elias said. "Doesn't announce itself out here, just shows up." "I noticed," Caleb replied. He took a sip, feeling the heat spread. "Your place holding up?" Elias snorted quietly. "It holds. Depends what you mean by up." He tapped the trailer's thin wall with his knuckles. It rang hollow. "This thing shakes when the wind looks at it wrong. Nights get loud, not the kind of loud you can ignore." He didn't explain further, and Caleb didn't push. Instead, he said, "I found something today." Elias's eyes shifted back to him, interest sharpening. "Yeah?" "A cave," Caleb said, watching the word land. "Out past the ravine, east-facing, dry, big enough to stand in without ducking." Elias's gaze went distant for Tatsutrahat. A second, as if he were looking at a map only he could see. His grip tightened on the mug. "Caves are quiet," he said finally. "Different kind of quiet." "That's what I thought," Caleb said. Elias took a breath, slow and controlled. "You thinking of camping?" "Thinking of more than that," Caleb admitted. "Thinking of not fighting the cold every night." Elias let out a low chuckle that had no humor in it. "You and me both." He stared into his coffee, the steam blurring his features. "I was infantry," he said abruptly, like ripping off a bandage. "Golf. Came home with a leg that doesn't listen and a head that doesn't know when the war's over. Trailers like this." He gestured around. "They're fine until the wind gets mean. Then everything rattles and the walls don't stop much of anything." He looked up at Caleb then, really looked. "You serious about that cave?" Caleb nodded. "Serious enough to remember how to get back." The how-to. Dog thumped his tail again, as if voting. Elias's mouth curved just a little. "Lucky likes the sound of it," he said. "He doesn't care where we are, long as it's warm. And I'm there." He paused, then added, "I know wood. Built things before the army, after too. Haven't built for myself in a long time." The admission sat between them, heavy but honest. Caleb felt the shape of an idea forming, careful, practical. "I could use another set of hands," he said, "and another mind." Elias studied him, then nodded once, decisive. "Show me," he said. "Tomorrow." They finished their coffee as the light drained away. Caleb rose, scratching Lucky's head one last time. "Tomorrow," he repeated. He mounted Rust and rode off, the trailer shrinking behind him. Elias watched him go, the lines in his face easing just a fraction. He hadn't agreed to anything out loud, not really, but when he closed the trailer door against the cold and lay down that night, the memory of rattling walls seemed farther away. Somewhere beyond the ravine, Stone waited, quiet and patient, and for the first time in years, Elias Boone let himself imagine a place where the night didn't argue back. Morning came to Sedona without ceremony, the kind of pale, hesitant dawn that seemed unsure whether to commit. A thin crust of frost clung to the shaded ground, and the air carried that brittle cold that made every movement feel louder than it should. Caleb Rourke was already awake when the first light slid across the red stone. He had slept lightly, the idea of the cave threading through his dreams, not as a vision, but as a set of practical questions. How deep, how dry, how steady. He saddled Rust with practiced efficiency, fingers stiff but certain, and set out before the town fully stirred. By the time he reached the wash where Elias Boone's trailer crouched against the land, the sky had shifted from gray to a thin blue, sharp as glass. Elias was waiting outside, bundled in a heavy coat that hung loose on his frame, his gray beard frosted at the tips. He stood with most of his weight on his good leg, posture careful, deliberate, as if he were negotiating terms with his own body, before taking a step. Lucky sat beside him, tail sweeping the dirt, eyes bright with the expectation of movement. "You're early," Elias said, though there was no complaint in it. His voice sounded steadier in the morning, less worn down by the night. "Didn't want to give the weather a head start," Caleb replied. He nodded toward Lucky. "You coming too?" Elias glanced down at the dog, the corner of his mouth lifting. "He'd follow me into a fire if I let him," he said. "Cave won't scare him." Lucky barked once, sharp and approving, as if to underline the point. Elias moved slowly into the passenger seat of Caleb's truck, wincing only slightly as he maneuvered his leg. The truck rattled to life, and they set out, the road narrowing, then dissolving into dirt, the town falling away behind them. Conversation came in pieces, about nothing important, about the way the winters seemed meaner lately, about jobs that vanished without warning. Elias spoke sparingly, choosing words with care, but when he did, there was a dry humor there, a soldier's way of coping that softened the edges of hard things. Caleb listened, hands steady on the wheel, the rhythm of the drive settling them both. When they reached the point where the road gave up entirely, Caleb parked and swung down, tying Russ to a juniper. Elias took a moment longer, bracing himself before standing, his face tightening, then smoothing as he found his balance. "Lead the way," he said. The ravine was quiet, sheltered from the wind, and as they walked deeper between the rock walls, Elias's pace slowed. He wasn't tired, Caleb could tell the difference, but attentive. His eyes traced the stone, the angles, the way the ground dipped and rose. Lucky trotted ahead, three legs moving with an efficient rhythm, stopping now and then to sniff at something only he found interesting. When the cave mouth came into view, Elias stopped short. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, shoulders slightly hunched, as if listening for something beyond sound. The cave looked the same as it had the day before, wide, unassuming, its entrance catching the morning light. But with Elias beside him, Caleb saw it differently, not just as shelter, but as a test. "That's it," Caleb said quietly. Elias nodded, eyes fixed on the opening. He stepped forward, slower now, each footfall deliberate. As he crossed the threshold, the change in air was immediate. The cold loosened its grip, the sound of the outside world tulling it. Elias drew in a breath and let it out carefully. "No echo," he said. "Not the kind that throws things back at you." He reached out, palm flat against the wall, fingers splayed. His hand lingered there longer than necessary. Caleb watched his shoulders drop a fraction, tension easing in a way that was unmistakable. They moved deeper, counting steps, measuring space with their bodies. Caleb paced off the width, then the depth, his boots scuffing dust that had lain undisturbed for years. Elias crouched with some effort, examining the floor, the slope, the way the water had once moved through here and then retreated. "Dry," Elias murmured. "That matters." He tapped the stone with his knuckles, listening to the sound. "Solid." Lucky settled near the entrance, half in, half out, as if claiming the border. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Caleb asked. Elias straightened, using the wall for support, his face thoughtful. "I'm thinking you could build here without fighting the land," he said. "That's rare." He turned slowly, taking it all in. Front wall to close it off, leave the back as stone, roof pitched enough to shed whatever this place decides to throw at us. The words came more easily now, the carpenter in him waking up. Caleb felt a surge of something close to relief. "I can haul timber," he said. "Know where to get it cheap." Elias nodded. "And I can make it fit," he replied. They must have stood there a moment longer, imagining not in grand strokes but in details, where a stove might go, how light would fall in the morning. The future took shape not as a dream, but as a plan. On the walk back, they encountered a man moving along the ravine with a camera slung around his neck. He was younger, late 20s maybe, tall and narrow-shouldered, with dark hair pulled back in a short knot. His beard was trimmed too neatly for the backcountry, and his jacket bore the logo of an outdoor magazine. He introduced himself as Nate Calder, a freelance photographer chasing unseen angles of Sedona. His eyes flicked from Caleb to Elias, lingering on Lucky with open curiosity. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here," Nate said, friendly enough. "Especially not this early." Caleb gave a non-committal shrug. "We're not exactly sightseeing." Nate smiled, lifting his camera slightly. "Mind if I take a few shots? The light's good." Elias stiffened almost imperceptibly, his jaw tightening. Cameras had a way of pulling him backward, of turning observation into exposure. Caleb noticed and stepped half a pace forward. "We'd rather not," he said evenly. Nate hesitated, then nodded, sensing the boundary. "Fair enough," he said. "If you change your mind, I'm around." He moved on, boots crunching away, leaving the ravine quiet again. Elias exhaled slowly. "Crowds follow curiosity," he said. "Something to keep in mind." Back at the truck they paused. The sky had cleared fully now, the sun climbing, but the cold lingered in the shadows. Caleb looked from Elias to the cave, then back again. "I'm not asking you to move tomorrow," he said, "but if you're in, I am." Elias met his gaze, pale blue eyes steady. "I'm in," he said simply. "Not because it's easy, because it's right." They parted with that understanding, no handshake needed. Caleb rode back toward town, Rust moving with renewed purpose, while Elias and Lucky returned to the trailer, the thin walls already feeling less permanent. That night, as the temperature dropped again and the wind tested every seam, both men lay awake in different places, measuring the same silence in their minds, knowing that soon it would belong to them. The work began without ceremony, the way most honest work does, slipping into their days as if it had always been there waiting. Caleb Rourke woke before dawn for a week straight, the cold needling his knuckles as he loaded the truck with chains, fuel, and the old tools he trusted more than anything new. Rust stood nearby, steam rolling off his flanks, patient and watchful, his age showing more clearly in the stiffness of his joints, but not in his eyes. The horse was 21 now, old for the work he'd done, but he still carried himself with a dignity that suggested he understood purpose even when his body protested. Caleb rubbed his neck longer than usual before leaving him tied at the edge of the cutting site, choosing trees carefully, favoring straight trunks that had grown slow and dense in the high desert. He didn't cut more than he needed. The land had already given him something precious. He wasn't about to take greedily. Each tree came down with a controlled groan, the sound echoing across the scrub and rock, and each log was trimmed and measured with the quiet precision of a man who'd learned that mistakes cost time and time cost warmth. Elias Boone arrived later that morning, moving slower but steady, his coat buttoned high, his gray beard catching sawdust like frost. He watched Caleb work for a while before saying anything, eyes tracking angles and cuts. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "If we square the ends now, we save ourselves trouble later." Caleb nodded, adjusting his grip. "That's what I was thinking." Elias set to work then, laying out joinery with chalk in a careful hand, the carpenter in him fully awake. His movements had a deliberateness born of adaptation, years of compensating for a leg that didn't always agree, but there was no hesitation in his decisions. He measured twice, sometimes 3 times, his mouth set in a line that suggested focus rather than doubt. Lucky kept close, nose twitching at every new smell, his 3-legged gait efficient and oddly graceful, as if he'd long ago decided the missing limb wasn't worth complaining about. By midday, the sun had climbed high enough to take the edge off the cold, and the work shifted to hauling. Caleb rigged the logs with rope and block, using the truck and Rust together, a slow choreography that required trust on all sides. Rust leaned into the traces when asked, muscles bunching under his winter coat, ears flicking back to listen for Caleb's cues. Elias watched closely, stepping in when needed, his hands sure on knots and pulleys. "He's still got it," Elias said, a note of respect in his tone. "He does," Caleb replied, pride softening his voice. They moved the first load toward the ravine, the logs thumping dully as they were set down near the cave mouth. It was there they met Martha Quinn, a woman in her late 50s who ran the nearest hardware store on the outskirts of town. She'd driven out in her dust-coated pickup, curiosity outweighing caution. Martha was broad-shouldered and solid, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical braid, her skin weathered from decades of sun and wind. She had the eyes of someone who'd seen plans fail and succeed in equal measure, sharp but not unkind. "Heard some talk," she said, leaning against her truck, arms crossed. "Figured I'd see for myself." Caleb wiped his hands on his jeans. "Talk travels fast," he said. Martha snorted. "Out here it does. Folks are saying you're building inside a cave." Elias stepped forward, meeting her gaze evenly. "We are," he said. Martha studied the cave, the stacked logs, the men. She nodded slowly. "Well," she said, "you'll need more than talk to pull that off. I've got reclaimed lumber out back, old beams from a teardown. Cheap if you haul." Caleb exchanged a glance with Elias. "We can haul," he said. Martha's mouth twitched. "I thought you might. She's," lingered a moment longer, lowering her voice. "Just be careful. People don't like what they don't understand." With that, she climbed back into her truck and drove off, leaving a faint trail of dust and a heavier thought behind. Over the next days, the rhythm set in. Mornings were for cutting and hauling, afternoons for fitting and stacking, evenings for planning by the light of a small fire Elias built near the cave entrance. They talked through the structure piece by piece, not romanticizing it, not rushing it. Elias insisted on a proper foundation, stones leveled and set to keep the wood from wicking moisture. Caleb worried about airflow, about smoke draw, about how the wind might behave once the front wall stood. They argued sometimes, but the arguments were clean, focused on solutions rather than pride. When one of them was right, the other conceded without ceremony. That kind of trust was rare, and both men felt it. Word spread, as it always does. A pair of locals. Stopped by one afternoon, men Caleb recognized vaguely from town, both in their 40s, both wearing skepticism like a badge. One was tall and gaunt with a long, untrimmed beard and a habit of squinting. The other was shorter, stockier, his hair cropped close, his hands jammed deep into his jacket pockets. They didn't introduce themselves. "You really think that's going to work?" the tall one asked, nodding toward the cave. Caleb didn't look up from where he was notching a beam. "We do," he said. The shorter man laughed, sharp and humorless. "Living like animals," he said. Elias straightened slowly, meeting their stares. His voice was calm. "Animals survive winters," he said. "People die in them." The men fell silent, unsettled by the quiet authority in his tone. They left soon after, boots crunching away, and the ravine settled back into its work-worn hush. That night, the temperature dropped hard. Frost crept along the truck's windshield, and the stars burned cold and bright overhead. Caleb and Elias sat by the fire, hands wrapped around tin mugs. Lucky curled between them, his breath warm against their boots. "You ever build something that mattered before?" Caleb asked, the question surprising even him. Elias stared into the flames, the firelight carving deep lines in his face. "In the army we built positions," he said. "They mattered for a while. Then we left or they were destroyed." He glanced around at the cave, the stacked logs. "This feels different." Caleb nodded. He understood that feeling, the difference between temporary and lasting, between holding a line and making a home. As the days passed, the first real structure took shape. The base of the front wall rose, logs fitted tight, corners squared true. Elias worked the joinery with a quiet pride, his hands remembering motions his body sometimes resisted. Caleb lifted and set, his strength steady, his movements economical. Rust stood nearby during Hassan. Brakes, head low, watching, while Lucky patrolled the perimeter, barking at nothing in particular, claiming the space as his own. One afternoon, as the sun dipped and shadows lengthened, Nate Calder appeared again, camera slung across his chest. He kept his distance this time, offering a wave. "Just wanted to say," he called, "what you're doing. It's interesting." Elias glanced at Caleb, then back at Nate. "Interest is fine," he said. "Interference isn't." Nate nodded, respectful. "Understood," he said, and left without another word. The acknowledgement lingered like a marker. They were being seen now, whether they wanted it or not. By the end of the week, the outline of a wall stood solid against the cave mouth, a promise made visible. Caleb ran his hand along the smooth fit of the logs, satisfaction settling in his chest like a warm weight. Elias stepped back, assessing with a critical eye, then nodded once. "Good work," he said. The praise meant more than either of them admitted. They covered the structure for the night, securing it against wind, and headed their separate ways, Caleb to his truck, Elias to his rattling trailer. As darkness fell, both men felt the same pull toward the cave, the same quiet certainty growing stronger. This wasn't just construction, it was preparation. And winter, patient and unforgiving, was already on its way. The wind arrived the way it always did in that country, without asking permission, without warning, and with a talent for finding weaknesses. It came down from the high desert 2 nights after the front wall rose, slipping through the ravine like a living thing, pressing its cold fingers against every seam and edge. Caleb Rourke was inside the cave when it started, tightening a temporary brace by lantern light, the flames shivering each time a gust struck the opening. The sound wasn't loud exactly, but it had weight to it, a low, insistent pressure that made the stone seem to breathe. Outside, Rust shifted in his tie line, hooves scraping rock, a soft, uneasy huff escaping his nostrils. The horse had known worse weather, years of it, but age made him less patient with discomfort. Caleb finished the brace, checked it twice, then stepped out to calm him, running a gloved hand along Rust's neck until the tension eased. Rust was leaner than he'd been in his prime, his coat thick, but dulled with years, the hollow above his eyes deeper now, yet there was still trust in the way he leaned into Caleb's touch, still that quiet understanding that had carried them both through work and loss. Elias Boone arrived shortly after, his truck grinding to a stop near the ravine, headlights cutting through the dust. He climbed out slowly, the wind tugging at his coat, his gray beard whipping against his jaw. His face was set in that familiar, careful expression, half alert, half guarded, that came from years of learning the cost of surprise. Lucky leapt from the cab after him, landing awkwardly but recovering with enthusiasm, barking at the wind as if it were an intruder he could chase off. "She's testing us," Elias said as he joined Caleb, voice raised just enough to be heard. "Good," Caleb replied. "Better now than later." They stood together for a moment, watching how the wind curled around the cave mouth, how it slid along the stone and lost some of its force before reaching the half-finished wall. Elias crouched, inspecting the base, fingers probing for movement. "Holds," he said, satisfaction threading through his tone. "But we'll need more weight up top, crossbeams, and a tighter seal along the edges." Caleb nodded. "I can get more timber tomorrow." The wind stayed with them through the night, rattling tools, testing ropes, howling across the open desert. Neither man slept much. Elias lay in his trailer, the familiar tremor of the walls pressing old memories close, but he found that his thoughts kept drifting to the cave instead, to the way the sound had softened there, the way the stone didn't argue back. Caleb sat in his truck with a blanket pulled tight, listening, thinking about how many winters he'd spent bracing against things that refused to give. By morning, the wind had moved on, leaving the air sharp and clean, the sky scrubbed blue. They reconvened early, fueled by strong coffee and the kind of urgency that only a close call provides. Work resumed with a new intensity. Elias directed the placement of crossbeams, his carpenter's eye narrowing as he judged angles and load. He explained as he worked, voice steady, practical. "You don't fight the wind," he said. "You give it a path to lose interest." Caleb hauled and lifted, muscles burning, breath fogging, the rhythm of labor pushing worry aside. They set additional supports, tightened joints, added stone where wood alone would have been an invitation for trouble. By midday, the structure felt different, less tentative, more assured. It stood not as a challenge to the elements, but as a negotiation with them. In the afternoon, a new figure appeared at the ravine's edge. Harlan Webb, a man in his late 40s with a build that suggested years of physical work and a face permanently set in a skeptical squint. His beard was thick and dark, shot through with gray, his hair cut short as if he didn't trust it not to get in the way. Harlan owned a small parcel of land farther out, had lost part of his roof the previous winter when an unseasonable storm collapsed it. That loss had left him sharp-edged, suspicious of promises. He approached with his hands on his hips, boots planted wide. "Heard the wind last night," he said. "Figured I'd see what it was chewing on." Caleb wiped his hands, meeting his gaze evenly. "Didn't take much," he said. Harlan looked at the wall, the supports, the cave itself. He frowned, then rubbed his beard. "You boys either crazy," he said, "or on to something." Elias straightened, resting his weight carefully. "Sometimes those overlap," he said. Harlan snorted, a reluctant smile tugging at his mouth. "You mind if I watch?" he asked. "Long as you don't stand under anything," Caleb replied. Harlan stayed for an hour, asking questions, his skepticism slowly reshaping itself into cautious interest. When he left, he nodded once. "Wind. Didn't win," he said. "That counts for something." As the days shortened, the interior work began to take precedence. They cleared more of the cave floor, leveling stone, hauling out debris that had collected over decades. Elias moved methodically, pausing often to stretch his leg, to reset his balance. Each pause cost him something, pride, patience, but he took them anyway, having learned the hard way what happened when he didn't. Caleb noticed and adjusted without comment, shifting tasks, lifting where needed, the unspoken coordination between them growing stronger. They framed the interior space with a clear sense of purpose, where the stove would sit, where light would enter, where a man could sleep without feeling boxed in. Lucky claimed a corner near where the warmth would be, circling it repeatedly until satisfied, then flopping down with a grunt. Rust, too, seemed to sense the change. He lingered closer to the cave now during breaks, the windless calm easing his joints, his ears swiveling less often toward imagined threats. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the stone in deep reds and purples, Elias sat on a crate, rubbing his leg, his face drawn. Caleb handed him a mug. "You don't have to push so hard," he said quietly. Elias took the mug, fingers trembling slightly from fatigue. "I know," he said. "But if I don't push at all, I stop." He looked up, meeting Caleb's eyes. "This place, it gives me something to push toward." The admission hung between them, heavy and honest. Caleb nodded. "We'll finish," he said. "One piece at a time." That night, another test came, not from the wind, but from cold. Temperatures dropped faster than expected, frost thickening, the air biting hard. They lit a small fire inside the cave, contained and careful, watching how the heat behaved. The stone absorbed it, held it, released it slowly. Elias leaned back, eyes closed, breathing easier. "That," he said softly, "is the sound of not freezing?" Caleb smiled, a rare, genuine curve of his mouth. Outside, the desert lay quiet under the stars, the cold, sharp, and unforgiving. Inside the cave, warmth gathered, tentative but real. They extinguished the fire carefully, covered the structure, and stood for a moment at the entrance, looking out. Winter was no longer an abstract threat. It was a presence they could feel closing in. But for the first time, neither man felt unprepared. The cave had taken its first stand, and it had held. Snow came the night they finished the chimney throat, quiet at first, almost polite, as if the desert were testing a new voice. Caleb Rourke noticed it when the air went strangely still, the kind of stillness that presses on the ears. He was inside the cave, fitting the iron collar where pipe would meet stone, his breath a faint cloud in the lantern light. Outside, flakes began to drift down, small and dry, catching on Rust's mane and the rough backs of juniper branches. Rust shifted, snorted once, then settled, the snow dusting his shoulders like ash. Lucky chased the first flakes with baffled delight, hopping and skidding on 3 legs, barking at the sky as if it had thrown a toy. Elias Boone watched from a crate near the back wall, his posture careful, one hand braced on his knee. He had taken the slower task tonight, measuring, checking clearances, running his fingers along seams the way a man reads Braille, because the leg was acting up, and he'd learned, with effort and cost, when to stop pushing. "It'll hold," he said, voice low but certain. "Stone's doing most of the work. We're just giving the fire a way to leave." Caleb nodded, tightening the last fastener and stepping back to look. The chimney rose through a narrow gap they'd left between roof and cave ceiling, stone stacked tight, the pipes straight and true. It wasn't elegant. It was honest. They had argued over it, briefly and cleanly, about draft, about distance from wood, about how much margin was enough, and the argument had made it better. When they were satisfied, they stood for a moment in the growing quiet, listening to the snow soften the world outside. "Let's see what it does," Caleb said. They built the first real fire that night, not the cautious kind meant only to test airflow, but a proper one with intention. Caleb laid the wood carefully, thicker splits beneath, kindling angled to catch, while Elias adjusted the damper with a practiced hand. When the flame took, it did so with a low, confident sound, not a roar, but a steady breath. Smoke lifted, hesitated, then drew cleanly up the pipe. Elias watched the draft with the focus of a man who'd seen what went wrong when fire didn't behave. "Good pull," he said. He leaned back, eyes half closed, the lines in his face easing as warmth began to spread. The stone walls absorbed it, held it, gave it back slowly, the cave learning the shape of fire as if it had been waiting for it. Outside, the snow thickened. By morning, the ravine wore a pale skin, the red rock dulled to rose, the ground muted and unfamiliar. Caleb stepped out early, boots crunching, breath sharp. He checked Rust first, brushing snow from the old horse's back, murmuring nonsense the way he always did. Rust blinked, calm, the warmth from the cave mouth already easing his joints. Lucky bounded out after him, nose down, leaving a chaotic pattern of tracks that crossed and recrossed as if the snow were a new language. He was determined to master. Elias followed more slowly, bundled against the cold, his breath coming measured. He paused at the threshold, looking back into the cave, then out again. "This," he said quietly, "is what I hoped for." They spent the morning sealing gaps, packing insulation where wood met stone, moving deliberately, aware that winter had decided to stay. In the early afternoon, a truck crunched into the ravine, tires struggling for grip. Lena Morales climbed out, stamping her boots, laughter bright against the cold. She was in her mid-30s, compact and strong, with dark hair tucked into a knit cap and eyes that missed very little. She ran the volunteer fire crew in town, a role she'd taken on after a warehouse fire years back had nearly killed a friend and taught her how thin the margin could be. Her jacket bore the scuffs of real use. "Heard you lit something," she said, glancing at the chimney with professional interest. "Figured I'd check you. Weren't trying to smoke yourselves." Elias met her gaze, respectful. "Draft's clean," he said. "Clearances, too." Lena stepped closer, crouched, inspected the pipe and stonework, fingers tracing lines, eyes following heat paths. She nodded once. "You did your homework," she said. "Fire likes that." She straightened, looking around. A place like this could save lives in a bad snap. Caleb didn't answer right away. He felt the weight of the words settle, heavier than praise. Lena lingered only a few minutes longer, offering a warning about snow load, about keeping the pipe clear, then left with a wave and a grin. The cave felt quieter after she went, the snow continuing its patient work. That evening, they ate inside by firelight, simple food, hands warming, the cave holding the heat the way Elias had predicted. The night passed without incident, the temperature dropping hard, then harder. When dawn came, the snow had turned from novelty to fact. They dug out, slow and steady, checking the roofline, brushing the chimney. The fire woke easily, the stone already warm. Elias moved with more confidence now, the cave's calm seeming to lend him some of its steadiness. On the third day, the storm changed its mind. Snow fell heavier, wind returning with teeth, the ravine filling and drifting. Visibility shrank, sound flattened. The world reduced itself to white and gray and the circle of warmth they had made. By midday, they heard it, the engine laboring, then dying, the sound swallowed almost immediately. A knock followed, tentative at first, then urgent. Caleb opened the door to find Jonah Pike and his daughter Miri, both bundled poorly for the cold, faces red and frightened. Jonah was a thin man in his early 40s, his beard patchy, eyes always darting as if he expected the ground to shift. He'd lost work the year before when the tourist season collapsed early, had taken to fixing what he could, never quite catching up. Miri was 8, small and serious, her dark hair braided tight, her lips blue at the edges. "Truck won't start," Jonah said, words tumbling. "We were trying to get to my sister's. I didn't know where else." Caleb stepped aside without a word. Elias had already pulled blankets down, motioning them in. Lucky circled Miri, tail wagging furiously, offering comfort in the way dogs do best, by insisting you were welcome. They warmed the girl slowly, careful and patient, Elias explaining as he worked, his voice calm, authoritative. Jonah hovered, wringing his hands, shame and fear wrestling on his face. "You did right," Elias told him quietly. "You came." The storm worsened. Another knock came an hour later, then another. Harlan Webb returned, beard iced, eyes wide, his skepticism stripped away by cold reality. He'd lost power, his place filling with snow. They took him in too, rearranging space, adding wood to the fire, the cave accommodating more than it had been built for. Stone radiated heat outward, enough that even those sleeping just beyond the framed interior were warmer than they would have been anywhere else. Night fell heavy and early. The wind screamed, the snow piled, and the cave held. They passed the hours telling small stories, playing simple games to distract Miri, sharing what food they had. Elias noticed something then, something he hadn't expected. The noise in his head, the sudden sharp echoes of memory, stayed muted. The cave did not throw the storm back at him. It absorbed it. When morning came, Pale and exhausted, the storm finally began to loosen its grip. They emerged to a changed world, drifts shoulder high, familiar shapes buried. Smoke rose from only a handful of places in the distance. Jonah stood at the cave mouth, eyes wet, gratitude raw. "You saved us," he said. Elias shook his head gently. "We shared what we built," he said. That day they helped dig out what they could, salvaged what remained. By evening, the cave was quiet again, the fire low, the work of survival settling into memory. Caleb stood at the entrance, watching the last light fade from the stone. Winter had arrived in earnest, and it had tested them not with theory but with need. The cave had answered. Fire had learned the shape of stone, and so had they. The days after the storm unfolded with a strange slowness, as if the land itself needed time to believe it had survived. Snow lingered in the ravine, compacted into hard drifts that caught the light and turned it sharp. The cave stood unchanged, its mouth rimmed with ice, smoke rising thin and steady from the chimney each morning like a signal fire that had decided to behave. Caleb Rourke woke early out of habit, but now there was a difference in the air inside the cave, less urgency, more intention. He moved through the space, checking joints, brushing ash, stacking wood, the simple rituals of maintenance grounding him in a way drifting work never had. Rust spent more time near the entrance than he ever had before, his old bones grateful for the windless calm. The horse's coat had dulled further with age, and his hips showed more sharply beneath the winter hair, but his eyes were clearer here, calmer. He slept standing just inside the stone's shadow, head low, as if the cave had become part of his herd. Lucky for his part, treated the place like a victory earned. He claimed routes, corners, blankets, moving on 3 legs with a confidence that made the absence of the 4th irrelevant. Elias Boone noticed these things more than he used to notice anything. The way animals settled told him what his body sometimes couldn't. He'd spent years reading threat in every sound, every shift of air, and now he found himself reading safety instead. His legs still ached, cold had not magically healed old damage, but he no longer pushed through pain out of stubbornness. He worked in measured stretches, then rested, accepting help without the old resentment. That change had not come from effort alone. It had come from the cave's refusal to echo. Word traveled faster than the snowmelt. By the end of the week, people began to appear at the ravine's edge, not in crisis this time, but with questions. Some came alone, some in pairs, bundled and cautious. They kept their distance at first, eyes flicking from the stone to the chimney to the men working. Caleb greeted them politely, briefly. Elias answered questions when they were practical. The curious lingered. The doubtful moved on. One morning, Dorothy Hale arrived with a notebook tucked under her arm and a pencil tucked into her gray bun. She was in her early 70s, thin as a fence post, her posture still upright despite years of work as the town's unofficial record keeper. Her glasses magnified eyes that missed nothing. She had lost her husband to a winter illness years ago, and since then she had made it her business to remember how things were done and why. "I don't need a tour," she said briskly. "I need to understand." Elias nodded, respecting the tone. He walked her through the basics: orientation, insulation, airflow, speaking plainly without selling. Dorothy scribbled, paused, looked up. "People forget the land teaches," she said. "They just stop listening." She left an hour later with a full page of notes and a promise to share them at the church meeting. Not everyone came with goodwill. A man named Curtis Bell showed up one afternoon, tall and broad, his beard meticulously groomed, his coat new enough to squeak. Curtis had recently invested in rental cabins down the highway, betting on mild winters and tourist dollars. He smiled too much, spoke smoothly, his eyes always calculating. "Interesting project," he said, glancing around as if appraising a product. "Ever think of scaling it?" Caleb met his gaze evenly. "We're building a home," he said. "Not a pitch." Curtis's smile tightened, then returned. "Just saying," he replied. "Innovation has value." Elias stepped closer, his presence quiet but unmistakable. "So does restraint," he said. Curtis laughed lightly, waved it off, and left, his boots leaving shallow impressions that the next snowfall erased. That evening, as the light faded early, Elias sat near the fire with Jonah Pike, who had returned to help clear snow and repay what he could. Jonah's hands were raw, his shoulders hunched, but there was a steadiness to him that hadn't been there before. "Mary sleeps through the night now," he said quietly. "After the cave." Elias nodded, understanding more than Jonah knew. The storm had left marks, but not all of them were scars. When the church meeting came, the building filled beyond capacity. Boots stomped snow from thresholds. Breath fogged the air. Caleb sat near the back, uncomfortable with crowds, while Elias stood beside him, posture straight despite the ache. Dorothy Hale spoke first, her voice thin but firm, laying out what she had seen and learned. Others followed. Lena Morales, practical and direct. Harlan Webb, less gruff than before, admitting what the cave had done when his own walls had failed. Curtis Bell spoke too, raising concerns about safety and regulation, his words polished, his concern selective. When it was Elias's turn, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He spoke about the physics of stone and fire, about wind and heat, about building with the land instead of against it. Then he spoke about something else. "I've lived with noise most of my life," he said. "The kind you can't turn off. This place," he paused, choosing the word carefully, "it quiets that. Not by hiding, but by holding." The room stilled. Caleb felt something shift, not applause, but attention, deeper and heavier. By the end of the meeting, no decisions were made, but something had changed. People lingered, talking in low voices, asking questions that weren't idle. Over the next weeks, the cave became a reference point. People came to see, to measure, to imagine. Not all would build like this, Caleb knew, but some would, enough to matter. Winter continued, harsh but predictable now. The cave held. Firewood lasted longer than expected. Nights passed without the old tension. Elias found himself sleeping through until morning more often than not. One night as they banked the fire, he looked at Caleb and said, "I used to think survival was the end of the story." Caleb glanced up. "And now?" Elias considered. "Now I think it's the beginning." The words settled between them, true and earned. Outside, snow fell again, lighter this time, almost gentle. The cave did not notice. It had learned its role. What had begun as shelter had become something else entirely, a place people oriented themselves around, a quiet answer to a loud season. Caleb stood at the entrance before turning in, watching the valley lights flicker in the distance, fewer than before but steadier. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt rooted. The quiet had stopped being an absence. It had become a signal, and people were listening. Spring did not arrive all at once. In the high desert around Sedona, it never did. It crept in sideways, stealing ground inch by inch, melting snow in the sun and freezing it again at night, testing patience the way winter had tested strength. The cave remained steady through it all. Where drifts had once pressed hard against the stone, rivulets now traced slow, careful paths down the rock face, water whispering instead of howling. Caleb Rourke noticed the change first in the mornings. He woke to birdsong echoing faintly from the cave mouth, the sound softened but not swallowed, and to the smell of damp earth warming under light. He had grown used to waking without urgency, without the need to assess danger before breath. That, more than comfort, told him something fundamental had shifted. He moved through the space with an ease that would have surprised the man he'd been a year earlier, the one who never unpacked fully, who treated stillness like a trap. Now he kept tools in their places, stacked wood with intention, and left his boots by the door because he expected to find them there again tomorrow. Rust shed his winter coat in ragged patches, revealing skin toughened by years of sun and wind. The horse looked older in the new light, the gray around his muzzle unmistakable, his joints slower to warm, but he also looked content in a way Caleb had not seen before. He spent his afternoons dozing just inside the cave's shadow, one hind leg cocked, eyes half closed, ears flicking lazily at flies instead of snapping to imagined threats. Lucky, too, changed with the season. His coat gleamed, his energy boundless, his three-legged lope a familiar rhythm now rather than a curiosity. He had appointed himself the cave's greeter, announcing every arrival with enthusiasm and accepting every scratch as his due. Elias Boone felt spring differently. The cold loosening its grip eased his leg, but more than that, the lengthening days eased something in his chest. He still had nights when sleep came unevenly, when memory pressed close, but they were fewer. He noticed that when the noise started, he could sit by the fire and let the stone do its work. He had stopped measuring his progress in pain-free hours and started measuring it in what he could build, what he could teach. That shift mattered. With winter behind them, the trickle of visitors became a stream. Some came to thank, some to learn, some simply to see. Elias found himself explaining things more often than he worked now. Why the wall angled the way it did, how the chimney draft behaved, why they had left certain stone untouched. He spoke plainly, without mystique. Caleb handled the physical demonstrations, lifting beams, setting posts, showing how muscle and leverage did the work better together than either alone. One afternoon, a woman named Sarah Whitlow arrived, riding in the bed of a dusty pickup driven by her brother. She was in her late 30s, tall and spare, her build wiry rather, then thin, with sun-browned skin and a shock of pale blonde hair cut short for practicality. Her eyes were a clear gray-green, steady and assessing, the eyes of someone used to solving problems without an audience. She had lost her husband 2 winters earlier to a construction accident, an event that had stripped her life down to essentials and left her intolerant of waste, of time, of materials, of words. She walked the site quietly, hands in her pockets, listening more than she spoke. When she finally addressed Elias, her voice was low and precise. "My land backs into a limestone ridge," she said. "There's a shallow cave there, not as deep as this, but dry. I want to know if it could work." Elias met her gaze, recognizing the combination of grief and resolve. "We can look," he said. They did, a few days later. Caleb rode ahead on Rust, the old horse setting a pace that matched Elias's stride. Lucky bounded along, scattering birds. Sarah's cave was smaller, but sound, its entrance sheltered, its stone promising. They talked through options, limitations, adaptations. Sarah asked hard questions, the kind that sharpened answers. She did not ask for help out of desperation, but out of intention. When she left, it was with a plan and a handshake that meant something. Curtis Bell returned once more, his interest now openly commercial, but found less room to maneuver. The community had learned the difference between sharing knowledge and selling it. Lena Morales began coordinating informal workshops, pairing those with skills and those with need. Dorothy Hale recorded it all, her notebook thickening with diagrams and names, a quiet archive of change. Harlan Webb broke ground on his own project with a crew of neighbors, his skepticism finally burned away by experience. Through it all, Caleb and Elias remained at the center, not as leaders who commanded, but as anchors who held. One evening, as the days stretched and the cave glowed with the low fire, of habit rather than necessity, Elias sat at the entrance, watching the valley breathe. "I didn't plan this," he said. Caleb leaned against the stone beside him. "Me neither." Elias smiled, faint but real. Turns out planning isn't the same as choosing. Caleb considered that. He had spent his life moving because movement was expected of him, because stopping felt like failure. Now he understood the difference between being stuck and staying. Staying was active. Staying took work. Staying meant committing to the weather and the people and the consequences. He found he did not resent it. Late that spring, when the last of the snow had retreated to the highest shadows, the town gathered again at the church, not for crisis this time, but for acknowledgement. There were no speeches meant to impress. Dorothy spoke briefly. Lena nodded her agreement. Elias stood only when pressed, his words few. "We used what was here," he said. "We listened." Caleb did not speak at all. He stood near the back, hat in hand, feeling the weight of eyes and the ease of it. Afterward, as people filtered out into the warming evening, Sarah found him by the door. "You staying?" she asked, not assuming an answer. Caleb looked out at the road, at the red stone catching the last light, at Rust waiting patiently, at Lucky asleep on the steps. He thought of the cave, of fire and stone, of a winter that had tried and failed to take what they'd built. "Yeah," he said, "I am." Summer came, then another winter, milder this time, but no less instructive. No one who had built with stone and care was lost. The valley changed, not all at once, not completely, but enough to matter. Years later, when newcomers asked how it had started, there was no single story, no hero's version. There was only a place and a choice, and the willingness to stay when leaving would have been easier. On a clear evening, long after the work of the day was done, Caleb and Elias sat by the fire, the cave warm, the wind outside passing harmlessly by. The shape of staying had revealed itself, not as an ending, but as a life built one deliberate piece at a time. Sometimes God does not send miracles with thunder and fire. Sometimes He sends them quietly, in the shape of a place that holds warmth when the world turns cold, in the form of people who choose to stay when leaving would be easier, and in second chances given to those the world has forgotten. That cave was not just stone and earth. It was shelter. It was mercy. It was a reminder that when we listen closely, God often speaks through creation itself. In our own lives, we may not face blizzards or red rock deserts, but we all face seasons of fear, loss, and uncertainty, and sometimes the miracle is not the storm ending. It's finding a place, a person, or a moment where we are held through it. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. We would love to pray for you. And if you believe that no child, no animal, and no soul should ever face fear alone, subscribe to this channel and walk with us through more stories of faith, love, and quiet miracles. May God bless you and your family. May He place warmth where there has been cold, peace where there has been fear, and light where there has been darkness. Amen.